And we begin with a Fox News alert on the America First national security strategy. While we now await the details of the president's plan, one that could dramatically change the relationship the U.S. has with the rest of the world. Good morning to you. I'm John Scott.
And I'm Melissa Francis. President Trump set to turn his campaign promises into official government policy when less than 3 hours from now, he outlines his blueprint for the military and his foreign policy vision.
This while the president takes aim at special counsel Robert Mueller over those thousands of Trump team emails, but makes it clear he is not going to fire Mueller over it. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts live with more on that. So what are we expecting today from the president's speech, John?
Yeah, the national security strategy, which the president has out in his first year, and not many administrations do that. They usually wait until the second year. The president will be laying out his new national security strategy, 2 o'clock this afternoon at the Reagan Building. It's really based on 5 pillars. All of which he talked about at length during the campaign and in the 11 months that he's been president. First of all, to protect the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life through strengthening border security, reforming immigration, among other things. To promote American prosperity by rejuvenating the economy through regulatory and tax reform, cutting new trade deals with some of our allies, preserving peace through strength, the old Reagan mantra, rebuilding and re-equipping the U.S. military, advancing American influence abroad, championing American values while not seeking to impose our way of life on anyone, and then pursuing a regional security strategy to work to promote security and stability in an entire region, not just among individual countries. The National Security Council spokesman Michael Anton says this is a departure from past national security strategies. Listen here.
This strategy puts more emphasis, more focus, more detail on homeland security and border security than any national security strategy ever has. And it's obvious why, because that's such an enormous challenge the United States faces. And it was one of the great themes that the president ran and won on in 2016.
In the strategy, the president specifically singles out China and Russia, saying, quote, China and Russia challenge American power, influence, and interests, attempting to erode American security and prosperity. They are determined to make economies less free and less fair, to grow their militaries, and to control information and data to repress their societies and expand their influence. The president believes that the United States has to rethink the policies of decades past that, quote, engagement with rivals and their inclusion in international institutions and global commerce would turn them into benign actors and trustworthy partners. For the most part, this premise turned out to be false. The president also repeating, and John, you mentioned this at the top, his assurance that he is not even thinking about firing the special counsel Robert Mueller. This pops up every few weeks, couple of months. This time, the idea was floated by a Democratic congresswoman who, with no apparent evidence apart from whispers on Capitol Hill, said that she believes the president may fire the special counsel over the Christmas break. Now, at every turn, the president, his press secretary, his legal team have knocked down such rumors. Sources say that the president's legal team has a good relationship with Mueller. They will be meeting with him this week. That the last thing they want is for Mueller to be fired, have another special counsel appointed, and have this whole thing reset and started again from scratch in a process that could drag out for months, if not years. On the way back from Camp David, the president responded to these new rumors that he was going to fire Mueller, saying that's not something he's going to do. Listen.
No, I'm not. No.
And now the question was, are you still considering firing Mueller? Apparently he never was. At the same time, officials from the Trump transition team are accusing the special counsel's office and the General Services Administration of wrongdoing. Corey Langhofer, who's an attorney for the transition, sent a letter to the relevant oversight committees on Capitol Hill charging that the GSA provided the special counsel's office with tens of thousands of emails from the transition, some of them privileged, without notifying the PTT that they were going to do that. But the special counsel's office and the GSA insist they did nothing wrong. The spokesman for the special counsel's office, Peter Carr, saying, quote, when we have obtained emails in the course of our ongoing criminal investigation, we have secured either the account owner's consent or the appropriate criminal process. John, a lot of discussion about this. You saw Alan Dershowitz on last hour. Judge Napolitano was of a different mind. This is going to get chewed over a lot in the next 24 to 48 hours. John?
But we know that Mueller is keeping his job, at least for now, right?
Well, I don't think there was ever any question of that, John. And again, this has come up many times, and at every turn, the White House says no.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen, but it keeps coming back up.
All right. John Roberts, our chief White House correspondent. Thank you, John.
Thanks.
And as we await the president's national security strategy, Michael Anton, National Security Council spokesman, says the plan represents a clear-eyed view of America's interests and capabilities abroad.
Principled realism, it's a way of saying that, we stick to American principles. The strategy is fundamentally consistent with American principles. It's also realistic about what American power can achieve in the world. And there's a frank recognition that the president's critique that he gave during the campaign of the past couple decades of American foreign policy, that it tried to do too much. It overly defined what America's national interests were, and American foreign policy also tried to do things that, frankly, we've learned through hard experience were perhaps not achievable with American power. And so this is a kind of necessary reassessment of what our interests really are.
Joining us now is Michael Warren, senior writer for the Weekly Standard. And I want to try and flesh out for the audience what the nuances are here, what the differences are. And if you look back at a speech that President Bush made in 2002 to West Point, and he kind of outlined this policy that we seem to have been following, where it is the idea of spreading democracy and free markets and freedom and free people everywhere we possibly can. This is a departure from that, right?
Yeah, I think so. And you didn't just hear it in that 2002 speech from President George Bush. You also heard it in his 2005 second inauguration speech, the idea of spreading democracy. It was a big part of President Bush's national security strategy. And, as I read the President Trump's national security strategy, there is a departure there. President Trump says there is not going to be an effort to, transfer our values or to impose our values onto other nations. That's simply in stark contrast between that and what President Bush argued, which was that it was a sort of a question of a balance of power that favored freedom, favored American values. You don't hear that so much. You hear much more in this Trump document about national sovereignty and letting all countries find common ground in their own interests.
Yeah, and he outlines three main challenges and kind of separates them into groups. One is Russia and China, sort of reemerging as large challengers to U.S. power everywhere. Then there's the rogue states of Iran and North Korea in a separate group. And then the third group is the threat from jihadis, from Islamic terror, from that group. He separates them out and sort of identifies that this theory of America first, protect America, protect our industry and increase influence abroad would be a better way to tackle these three major challenges. What do you think?
Yeah, that's right. The view from the Trump administration is that power is something that the America needs to be consolidating, and that those challengers that you mentioned, particularly China and Russia. And it's interesting. I went back again and looked at the George W. Bush national security strategy, and there was this idea at the beginning of the century that China and Russia were possible partners in sort of they were emerging, and that the Bush administration was hopeful that they could sort of be brought into a more peaceful, freedom-loving global community, and that obviously hasn't happened. That has changed. You also heard this in some of the remarks you had from that statement earlier that I think were definitely a shot at the Obama administration and the Obama administration's effort to sort of bring Iran into the community of nations. That is certainly something that the president on the campaign trail castigated the Obama administration for.
Do you think it's fair to say, looking at the evidence, if you look at the spread of ISIS, you look at how much terror there is going on everywhere, the attacks that we see going on in Europe and here at home, you look at nuclear proliferation as it appears to be happening in Iran and North Korea, that this other policy of spreading democracy and even nation building hasn't worked?
I don't know. I think it's a lot more complicated and complex than that. There were certainly some successes from what George W. Bush argued for. If you look at the way that he left what was happening in Iraq, the way he left when he left the White House, a lot of successes there. And this is a criticism that Donald Trump, of course, made of President Obama, that was a war that had been re-won after the surge in 2007 that Obama had lost. I think that there's what you're seeing here, though, is certainly a shift in Republican foreign policy from the George W. Bush administration. That's reflective of frustration among certain people in this administration and members of the Republican Party itself. From those Bush years, and frustration that I think is not entirely warranted, but in many ways is warranted.
Yeah, I mean, you've heard a lot of people rail against the idea of nation building and the amount of blood and treasure that has been left behind and spilled based on the idea of trying to spread democracy. I wonder, from a practical point of view, how do you see this taking shape? If this is the shift in doctrine, how do things look different in how we behave internationally?
Well, I think this is an inconsistency in the national security strategy released from the Trump administration today, which is that the strategy talks a lot about sort of being making sure America is inserted into the world and our influence is expanded, but yet the sort of idea that we shouldn't be out there nation building. I think that's a sort of a exaggeration of what the Bush administration was arguing for, and it comes into conflict there. I think the Trump administration wants to be involved. You see the involvement in Syria, for instance, the retaliation against that attack, but yet doesn't want to entirely engage in that region. It's not a great situation. You look at North Korea, for instance. This is a very, very dicey situation that the Trump administration was handed.
All right. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Good insight.
Well, President Trump praised for the defeat of ISIS, while one New York Times columnist says the president's foreign policy success is being ignored. Plus, travel resumes out of Atlanta's main airport after a major power outage as the holiday travel rush ramps up. Thousands of passengers find themselves in a chaotic and scary scene.
We walked down the escalator, which was a nightmare. Then we have to go through the tunnels that are pitch black. It's scary. You don't know. It's might snatch your bags, whatever, you know? That was a nightmare.
We are monitoring a situation right now, a high-speed Amtrak derailment in DuPont, Washington. Amtrak has tweeted, "We are aware of an incident involving Amtrak train 501. We will update with additional details as they become available."
Well, a New York Times columnist praises President Trump's approach and success in defeating ISIS, but says this victory has essentially gone unnoticed. In a column titled "A War Trump Won," conservative columnist Ross Douthat says one reason for the lack of fanfare is because it didn't require going to war with Syria. He also points to another reason, writing, "But this is also a press failure, a case where the media is not adequately reporting an important success, because it does not fit into the narrative of Trumpian disaster in which our journalistic entities are all invested." Let's bring in today's media panel. Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and author Judy Miller, and Tammy Bruce, a conservative radio talk show host, both of them Fox News contributors. What about it, Tammy? You read the column.
I did.
Are the press ignoring the president's success in defeating ISIS?
I think it's pretty obvious they are. But what was interesting about his column was that it begged the question in and of itself. He started out by effectively saying that the president's own behavior creates controversies that overshadow effectively great news like this. And we have defeated ISIS, and that's what's remarkable. It's just like another day, right? It's not something that people thought was a big deal, whereas in fact it's a huge deal. But it also tells you that when a columnist admits that the president got something right becomes news, that highlights the problem that we have with the media, that in and of itself is news. But we can tell you as an example, it's not because of the president's creation of controversies, it's that the media creates them. As an example, when we were defeating ISIS, what President Trump likes to call fake news from CNN, they were talking about how James Comey was going to say that he, in fact, told Donald Trump that he was under investigation. The number of firings at CNN for a false report about Anthony Scaramucci being under investigation. And most recently, the false report at CNN and MSNBC about the WikiLeaks drop, that President Trump allegedly got it a week before anyone else, whereas in fact, it was after the fact like everyone else. So that becomes the news of gossip and the news of what's really happening in the country. Good news is ignored.
It is true, Judy, that, a couple of years ago, all of the headlines out of the Middle East were, people being beheaded en masse or burned alive. ISIS was a really scary organization. Now the Iraqi prime minister has said, they're all but done.
Right. Well, they're all but done on the ground. They're all but done territorially. The caliphate is dead.
Yep.
But as I'm sure Tammy remembers, we all remember because we were around New York on October 31st, Halloween, the ideology of ISIS persists, and that, the president himself has said, will continue to pose a challenge. But here's the thing. Yes, the president doesn't get sufficient credit for carrying out the policy that Ash Carter implemented in the last year of the Obama administration. Obama screwed this up. We have ISIS, in part because of Obama. But at least Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, put in a new strategy which Donald Trump was smart enough not to fiddle around with.
Yeah, and Douthad gives credit to the Obama administration for at least getting things lined up to make this success possible. But it's also true that the president chose some militarily knowledgeable people to be his chief of staff, as well as his secretary of defense.
Yeah, I remember there was, of course, some concern at the beginning when he was surrounding himself with generals, that it was going to be a military coup of some sort. And now we know why. Clearly, the world has been preparing for war. But the military generals within these last 6 months have also said that the president, separate from whatever policies were being implemented last year, let them do their job. His policies were, you're on the ground, you know what's best. We're going to stop micromanaging this from the Pentagon, from Washington, if you will, from air-conditioned suites, and we're going to let the people on the ground make these decisions. That was a significant change that was done by the Trump administration. And of course, the generals were saying over the last several years, we would need 3 to 4 months to get rid of ISIS. They were saying that for years, and it proved true. So the military, at least certainly, already they knew what they needed to do. They needed a commander-in-chief to let them do it.
You've reported from that part of the world many, many times.
Yes.
Is this the case of military unshackled?
The military was unshackled, but the strategy was put in place in the last year of the Obama administration. It's kind of like giving George Bush credit for the surge. A lot of reporters didn't want to do that either. Yes, it was Bush whose faulty strategy got us into the mess and helped create ISIS, or what became ISIS in the very beginning. But then George Bush came in and trusted his generals and went with the surge. The media took a long time to get onto that narrative as well. And I think there's a little of that, especially because Donald Trump has declared war on the media. So they're not willing and able to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that the media does move a narrative.
Yeah.
Gone are the days when it's just about reporting the facts of the matter. Very different than when Judy Miller is doing work at the New York Times. A very different dynamic about what is going to suit us better and what do we want to report. And what the American people don't see is what's not reported. That's why this conversation is so important.
There's a limited amount of space in a major newspaper, and right now ISIS is not consuming almost any of it.
Right. Donald Trump sets the narrative. Yeah. If he wanted to talk about the ISIS victory, he could do so.
Judy
Not
Miller.
that he'd be covered.
Judy Miller and Tammy Bruce, thank you both.
Thank you.
Melissa.
The lights are back on, but passengers warned to expect delays following a major power outage at Atlanta's airport. Plus, 2 Washington state police officers recovering after a gun battle. The suspect, known to authorities from previous incidents, firing multiple rounds.
This is a suspect we've been dealing with over a long period of time. It's really been ramping up for the last couple of weeks. If you're
So we are just now getting pictures of that high-speed Amtrak derailment that we told you about in DuPont, Washington. Take a look at these pictures. It appears that the train, look at that, went off an overpass, and now all southbound lanes of I-5, we are hearing, are shut down due to a train car on the highway. The derailment happened at about 7:30 a.m. local time, so that would be 10:30 a.m. here in the east, maybe about an hour ago. The Washington Department of Transportation shows a train car hanging partway off an overpass and resting on the road. There is no word when it will be back open, that highway, or if anyone was injured. We do not have that news as of yet. This is all we know. This happened about an hour ago. Take a look at that picture as that train car apparently sped off the overpass and fell onto the highway below. We will bring you updates just as soon as we have them.
Also in Washington state, 2 police officers recovering after being caught in what officials call a firefight. 2 Bremerton officers approached the driver of an SUV, a suspect in a domestic violence protection order. Officials say the 53-year-old man fired numerous shots at the officers. They then fired back, hitting that gunman. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Both officers also struck, but they are expected to be okay.
Airline passengers traveling from Atlanta's airport being urged to check with their airlines as flights resume. Power has been restored after the airport was plunged into darkness on Sunday, grounding 1,000 flights. Now not the way you want to kick off the holiday travel rush.
How could this possibly happen to an airport this important and this size? The first thing that everybody thought was terrorism. That was the buzz everywhere. We're here, we're safe, we hope to get out.
How terrifying. Jonathan Siri is live at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. What a mess.
Yeah, what a mess indeed. Georgia Power officials believe that this was just faulty equipment setting a fire in an underground electrical facility, causing this power outage. But you can see the disruption. Passengers here lining up to rebook on flights. And at least the situation now is under control compared to yesterday when the power went out for nearly 11 hours. Escalators weren't working. Elevators weren't working. That left some passengers in wheelchairs stuck on upper concourse levels. People were separated from their luggage because baggage conveyors weren't working and jetways couldn't be wheeled into place, leaving many passengers stranded on their planes.
I literally spent a whole 7 hours on an airplane without food or water, and then they finally let us off. And then I walk into a dark room where everyone's sleeping on the floor.
Now, the power outage affected all airlines servicing this airport, but Atlanta-based Delta, by default, is going to be the largest and the most impacted. They canceled 1,000 flights yesterday, canceled 300 flights today, and although airport
Or you can make goofy faces. That's fun, too.
Right now, California firefighters have the massive Thomas Fire 45% contained, as crews say they hope to take advantage of higher humidity and lower winds now. But the fire has burned about 270,000 acres since it broke out 2 weeks ago today. Adam Housley live in Ventura for us. Adam?
Yeah, John, hard to believe it. 2 weeks ago, basically, we're standing here as the house right next to me burned down into the one behind it. Firefighters stood in that backyard with flames and embers blowing over the home and sprayed it down and kept it and saved it. One of the few on the street that have been saved. But you can see the destruction here in the foreground. This is one of several hundred homes in this neighborhood that burned to the ground that day. Just complete devastation here as the Thomas Fire is now only 2,500 acres away from surpassing the Creek Fire back in 2003 as the largest fire in state history, burning 420 square miles. That's nearly the size of the city of San Antonio. Officially, it's 45% contained with some 8,500 firefighters battling the flames. They won't achieve full containment here until after the new year. And while things are calmer today, which is good news, and they seem to be getting a pretty good handle on it over the weekend, there was some erratic winds on Saturday, extremely dry conditions as well. Some of the gusts on Saturday were 65 miles an hour, causing flare-ups near Montecito, which is Santa Barbara, basically 30 miles from where I'm standing right now. Several homes there were lost back then. The Berman family returned to find what was little left of their home, even though firefighters pulled out as much as they could before it burned down.
We knew the fire was close, and we knew it was close for the whole week, but we really believed that it was going to be okay. And this is incredibly hard to look at.
It was also an emotional day, hard to look at for the family and friends of fallen firefighter Corey Iverson. His funeral procession stretched some 200 miles from Ventura all the way to San Diego. Hundreds lined the roads waving American flags as his hearse passed by. The 8-year veteran died on Thursday from smoke inhalation and burns as he was fighting the Thomas Fire. The 32-year-old Iverson leaves behind his pregnant wife, Ashley, and a 2-year-old daughter. Donations from a GoFundMe account continue to pour in. And John, some of those people that line the freeway, I knew a few of them, grew up with them. They would go back through these sites later in the day and literally sift through this stuff, trying to find anything they could, any memento that's left. And John, if you look at this stuff, as I give it back to you, there's like some green, it's like a green slime over it. That's actually seed. It's all been sprayed. They sprayed all these homes and hillsides with seed in hopes that the rains will finally come and help set some of this growth into this dirt, because the next threat, of course, would be mudslides. But right now, there's still no major rain in the forecast here in Southern California, John.
What a tragedy. Adam Housley, who lives in that area or comes from that area. Adam, thank you.
Big week on Capitol Hill as Republican leaders in Congress aim to hold votes on their tax reform bill early this week before cutting a deal with Democrats on the budget bill on Friday. Some of the biggest challenges in the final tax bill include lowering the corporate rate and most of the rates for individual income taxes.
Maybe the biggest surprise here for everyone is that the conference committee report turned out a bill better than either in the House and Senate. That rarely happens. And I think lowering that top rate is especially important for families in those SALT states, and making sure that the rates kick in now for every size business in America to make them more competitive immediately. Again, I think a big improvement over the House or the Senate.
Let's bring in our panel. Richard Fowler is a Fox News contributor and radio talk show host. John Jordan is a Republican strategist and sits on the Hoover Institute Board of Overseers. John, let me start with you. Do you agree with that statement that in conference committee this bill got better?
I think it did. This bill is going to pass. It's going to pass in a walk, because in contrast with what the Democrats proposed, their signature piece of legislation, which involved taking money from people, taking away choice, and forcing them to buy a product they didn't want, the Republican signature piece of legislation so far involves giving people more money and more choice, and it benefits the American public in three ways. First of all, despite Democrat protestations that are becoming ever more shrill with each passing day, Americans are going to receive a tax cut. They're going to have a smaller tax bill. Two, 43 million American households are invested in the stock market, and they're already seeing their nest eggs and net worth grow. And that includes 54% of earners between $35,000 and $75,000 a year. And lastly, as the slack is taken out of the labor market, you're going to see, in accordance with the laws of supply and demand, upward pressure on wages.
Okay.
So Republicans are betting that Americans like having more money and having more choice and seeing their net worth grow.
Richard, I mean, do you think that it'll be tough for Democrats down the road if that happens and then they, voted against it?
I think it would be tough if that actually happens. I think that is a lot of idealism in his analysis there.
Well, where is it wrong? Tell us.
Well, I think number one is this. I think this ideal of depending on corporations to somehow magically spend all this money they get back in tax returns is very idealistic. One, it's because we know this, is that corporations have a lot of money already on their books. Let's take Apple, Microsoft, and Google. Those three companies together have $464 billion sitting in savings accounts right now. They're not spending that money, so you're just going to add to that money, and they're not going to create any jobs. They're not going to add any money to the
John,
economy.
What's the difference between all the capital on the balance sheet and knowing that they have lower taxes indefinitely going forward? How do corporations behave differently, John?
I'd like to respond to that.
Yeah.
This illustrates why economic literacy is so important in these discussions. When these companies repatriate a lot of this money, which is held overseas, almost $4 trillion, they have to either spend it or save it. And even if it's stock buybacks, that's going to increase the net worth of the 43 million American households that are invested in the stock market. But more to the point, economics is about expectations and incentives. And when companies realize that the government's war on the private sector and war on success is over, they're going to make bets on the future. And those bets involve investments and hiring people. And that's what our friends on the left just don't seem to grasp.
Richard, one of the things is if a company does just hoard the cash and doesn't either lower prices or hire more people or invest or raise wages, their competitor is going to do that and eat their lunch. I mean, that's what the free market is all about.
Oh, I get that, and I appreciate him trying to educate me on economics. I actually am an economist by training.
Yeah.
I'm an economist by training.
I have two university degrees in economics.
Okay, we're all smart.
So do I,
Richard,
but
go ahead.
Let me continue. That would make sense in the ideal that we live in a supply-side economy, but we actually don't. Here in the United States, we are a demand-side economy where we are Our economy is pushed by the fact that we're pushed by consumer demand, and that means we're pushed by the middle class and working class people spending money. And what this tax plan doesn't do is it doesn't encourage working class and middle class families to go out and buy things. It actually gives more money to corporations and rich people. And when you give more money to corporations and rich people, they have a higher marginal propensity to save money than they do to actually spend money. If you want people to spend money, you're better off giving it to working class and middle class families. That bill
I think
doesn't
they are
do
getting
that.
the money, John.
Well,
I
the
mean, Nancy
stimulus program
Pelosi got
didn't exactly
four
work.
Pinocchios for
Actually,
statements like
it
that.
did do that. That's why we had 72 consecutive months of job growth, sir.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, barely. I mean, coming from
But
the
it
worst,
is job
deepest
growth.
recession in American.
And we've seen the stock market
Wait,
growth.
wait a second.
I
Job growth is
appreciate the
happening
fact-
now
one at a
since
time,
the
guys, so
election,
everybody
since
can
the
hear.
war in
No,
success.
No.
Stop.
When President Obama got this economy, there was job loss. And that was year one of President Obama. In year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, we saw job growth every one of those years.
I want to get back to the tax bill. Hang on, guys. Whoa. John, talk to me about what the middle class is going to see with this tax break, because that is one of the big points. Nancy Pelosi saying the middle class is getting hosed. The Republicans saying that they're getting a tax break. What do you see as the truth?
Okay, well, first of all, that's patently false. The middle class is getting a significant tax cut. The Democrats are scared of being exposed on this falsehood, by the way. Secondly, as I pointed out, 43 million American households
middle class getting a tax
are
cut?
invested in the stock market, and they're already seeing their net worths increase.
So explain to me
43 million American households are invested in the stock market. Look it up, Richard.
Explain to me how a middle class family in Livingston, New Jersey is getting a tax cut.
Gentlemen, I'm so sorry. We're going to have to leave it there because we have
They're not
breaking
New
news.
Jersey,
We do very much appreciate the
You're
spirited
exactly right.
discussion.
They're not
I'm
getting
certain
middle
you'll
class.
both
They're
be
not getting a
back.
tax cut in Livingston, New Jersey.
Richard?
There's a
Richard,
world
hey, guys.
outside of New York.
Guys,
Thanks, Melissa.
That's it. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. See you later.
Fox News, we are getting more information now on that Amtrak derailment in Tacoma, Washington. This the first day that Amtrak was providing service along that particular stretch of the track so that they could provide train service to the Amtrak Cascades Tacoma Dome station. We are going to pause for one moment now to let our Fox stations join us. This is Fox News coverage of an Amtrak train derailment. I'm John Scott in New York. This on the 18th of December. Amtrak was crowing about its new service to the Amtrak Cascades Tacoma Dome station. Now there has been what looks like a terrible train derailment within, a mile or so of the new station. You can see an Amtrak train left dangling over Interstate 5 right there along the Puyallup River in Washington. We can't tell for sure from this still photo how many cars actually came down on the highway and whether any vehicles, any automobiles were underneath them. Amtrak has not said anything about the number of injuries resulting from this derailment. They did put out this statement. Amtrak is aware of an incident with train 501 Cascade service from Seattle to Portland. Emergency services are on the scene and Amtrak management is responding. Some injuries are reported. The Pierce County Sheriff's Office now says injuries and even casualties are reported. So that is an update over the last couple of minutes. Numbers to come on that. John Hyatt is a railroad investigator. He joins us on the phone from Seattle. John, you have to think that somehow Amtrak operating on this new stretch of track so they could open up this new station had to play a role in this accident.
Well, it's awful early to tell. There's also some reports that the train struck a truck on the tracks. And but looking at the photographs, the lead locomotive seems to be intact and on the track. And then the other car, of course, as you're looking at, is hanging off onto the I-5 pass. You have the Puyallup River running right alongside there. Obviously, the fortunate thing is it's very easy access for emergency people. But, I fear there's got to be some casualties on this train. It looks pretty bad. I don't know. I think this is, as you said, the first day that they ran the new route. But I highly suspect, at least the initial indications are, that it may have struck something on the track.
Yeah, and the information that you're getting is that there was a truck or some kind of vehicle on the track?
Initially, there was a transportation person working on the train since it was the new route, and he was tweeting along as he went. And then he tweeted that they had just struck a truck and derailed. And that was the last tweet that they had gotten from him. So that's all the information I'm going by, and it's just so early to tell. I was just on my way down the I-5 this morning, and I had to obviously cancel.
Yeah, and these cars are very robustly built, so that still picture that we showed earlier that showed one end of the car still up there, and there is the photo. One end of the car still essentially attached to the train, the other dangling down onto the tracks. You have to imagine that it's similar, to a human being jumping off that bridge and landing on the concrete below. That's the kind of impact that train car would have had as it hit the highway.
Yeah, and the fortunate thing is that the one end did stay connected to the train. Otherwise, you lose the entire car, and obviously that would be much worse. But just looking at the photos, it's bad enough, and I'm praying and hoping for the best for these people. I know it's the onboard people that Amtrak have are trained to try to handle this the best they can, but this may be well out of their I don't think they're going to be able to handle this on their own. But you can see that there's a ton of emergency people, and that's the fortunate part. So we'll be getting more information soon, I'm sure. But it does sound initially like, and I'm just telling you from things that have been tweeted by the Department of Transportation, that it looks like they may have struck something on the track.
Mm-hmm. Old habits die hard. If this was, in fact, a new line to Amtrak, I'm guessing that the rails already existed, but maybe trains didn't use them all that much. Perhaps the driver or operator of whatever vehicle this was just wasn't accustomed to having trains roll along there at this hour of the morning?
I'm just not sure. There was a 30-mile-an-hour curve right before you get into this area, and, of course, that there was some unfamiliarity, but I really don't know that that's the case. I mean, it sounds to me like they struck something. However, there are so many possibilities, and the track had been in use. It just hadn't been used for this particular route. Right. So I'm sure it had been inspected and so forth, and there's just so much information yet to come out, and I'm sure in the next hours we'll find out a lot more information. And at this point, the Pierce County people already are reporting casualties and injuries, and I just don't know how to interpret that.
Yeah. Amtrak spent years planning this new service. Again, they just cut the ribbon on the Amtrak Cascades Tacoma Dome Station, which, looking at it on the map, is only about a mile from where this accident took place. But they spent years planning it. They spent $800 million in upgrades on not only the station, but also the tracks. And yet something like this happens.
It's been a huge project, and again, not knowing exactly what caused it. But if it is something like a truck on the track or something, it's one of those things that's very hard to prevent. But at this point, looking at the locomotive, I didn't see a lot of damage on the front of the locomotive, so I just don't know. I'm about 10 miles from there, and I'm going to try to make my way out there here pretty soon, but the traffic is just outrageous.
Yeah, I can imagine. This is Melissa Francis. I'm looking at some of the witness accounts online on social media, and they're saying it felt like they were suddenly going downhill, and then they hit the seats in front of them. I mean, what must that impact have been like?
Oh, it had to be very frightening. It something this large moving that fast, and then all of a sudden having speed deterred. Obviously, all the kinetic energy and everything else involved, it's going to be very treacherous. And as I said, it's probably a good thing that one half of the car is still hung up. I'm just saying that probably cushioned a lot from a lot worse blow that could have taken place. There's just so much to find out here, and I know in the next hours we'll know a lot more information.
You mentioned that it was a clue that if you look at the picture closely, you can see that the car in front of the one that is dangling from the overpass is still on the track. So this wasn't the lead car. What do you infer from that?
Well, that's so hard to infer. I mean, in an instant like that, you would tend to think that it was more mechanical, more track involved. But the report, and that's all I'm going by, is the one tweet from the State Department, Department of Transportation, that said they had struck a truck. Now, how he knew that, being back in the train, I don't know, unless he got up there and spoke to somebody. But it is unusual that if they did strike something, that the engine stays on and other cars derail. But there's so many things involved in what took place here, and I don't know exactly if that track, what the track speed is right there, but it looks like they must have been going at a bit of a slower rate of speed. Otherwise, I believe that car probably would have gone all the way off.
We know that they were heading on a new route to a new station. Do we know if this was the first train to go through there, or if others went ahead of it today?
I believe this was the first one, is what I've been told by a couple of different Amtrak employees, that this was They thought it was the very first one. They usually go around what's called the Lakeview subdivision, and this time they actually come right along the river, and it's a shorter route and it's a faster route, and track speed's higher. And at one point shortly before the incident, they were going at 79 miles an hour, which is track running speed right through there. And the State Department transportation person was commenting on how they were passing trains on I-5 just prior to this. And then they must have slowed down to come into that curve that I spoke of, and something terrible happened.
Yeah. John Hyatt is a railroad investigator and authority, our guest with us right now as we continue to cover this Amtrak derailment on the first day of service in the Tacoma area. There are casualties reported, injuries reported as well. How many, we do not yet know. Jonathan Hunt is covering for us from our Los Angeles bureau and has a little bit more information for us now. Jonathan?
John, this was Amtrak 501. It had gone through Seattle and had stopped, as we understand it, at the new station in Tacoma. And it was just south of Tacoma that this derailment appears to have happened, near the town of DuPont. Now, as we have been looking at the map here, it appears that it was taking a curve near the Eagles Pride golf course. And out of that curve, it goes across I-5. And that's the picture you're looking at